For a majority of its history, Animal Crossing was about moving into a town that didn't belong to you. The villagers had their own routines, the world had its quirks, and you yourself were just another villager. But in Animal Crossing New Horizons, that relationship completely flipped. Players now have the power to shape every part of the island themselves. And while that freedom made the series bigger than ever, it may have also created a problem. Early Animal Crossing was a much simpler game compared to what the series is today. And that simplicity wasn't a weakness, it was the reason the world felt alive. Villagers living their day-to-day lives, shops opening and closing, seasons passing in real time. Life moved on regardless if you were there or not. All things that are still core parts of the franchise to this day, but there was one crucial distinction. You see, back then, you weren't the architect of your town. You were just another resident. Your control over the world was limited, and that limitation was intentional. If you didn't like where the rivers were placed, sorry bud, you were out of luck. You couldn't terraform the land around you. The town you moved into was the town you got, and you were happy with that. The town felt like an actual place and not some project or canvas. And for several games, the series held on to that philosophy. Even in Animal Crossing New Leaf, when the player became the town's mayor, you had influence rather than full authority. Animal Crossing worked because the world didn't necessarily revolve around the player. And then the series would go on to change that relationship entirely. When Animal Crossing New Leaf released, it gave the player something that had never been in the series prior. You were brought on as the town's mayor, and along with that role, given public works projects, town ordinances, and infrastructure choices. For the first time, the player could play a role in the town's improvement and overall feel. Despite this newfound power, it was still very limited. You were influencing the town, not designing it. Of course, that would change with the next installment. Animal Crossing New Horizons was a pivotal turn in the series' design philosophy. No longer were you just a resident, not just a mayor, you were fundamentally the sole creative force of your own personal island. For the first time ever, you could fully terraform the terrain, raise and lower cliffs, river placement, and probably the biggest change was the ability to put furniture and decorations outside of houses on the fly. You had full control over your world. And while that freedom wasn't necessarily a bad thing, it did fundamentally change the fantasy. There was a dramatic frame shift. No longer were you moving into a living town. You were now designing the perfect town. Players stopped adapting and living in the environment, and now the environment was the one doing the adapting. At this point, Animal Crossing quietly stopped being a simulation and instead started becoming a creative sandbox. What did players do with that newfound freedom? Well, it went the way of social media, of course. Islands became highly curated spaces. Aesthetic builds, perfectly designed environments meant to be shared and showcased. Islands were now becoming centerpieces on Instagram and Twitter posts. No longer were islands a place to live. They were something to perfect. And while that freedom made Animal Crossing bigger than it had ever been, it also changed something about how the world worked. Because when players control everything about a world, that world starts behaving very differently. Also, real quick, you're going to notice me switching between island and town. Like, they're one and the same. You never had your own, like, buildable island in the game before, but you've always had a town. So just, when I say island, it's town. When I say town, it's island. It's all interchangeable, okay? Stick with me here. With all of this freedom, New Horizons allowed players to shape their environment in ways the series had never allowed before. That freedom is a large part of why the game became such a massive success, both commercially and culturally. But systems that give players total control behave very differently from the ones that don't. The thing that made earlier Animal Crossing towns feel so alive wasn't just the villagers or the seasons changing, it was the fact that the world was a living, breathing thing that existed outside of the player's control. Villagers had their lives that didn't necessarily revolve around the player. The layout of the town had quirks that you didn't design. The town itself had its own identity, and as a resident of said town, you had to adapt to it. It felt like being the new kid in school. That independence created the illusion of life. Interestingly, you can see just how much players still value that feeling today. Nintendo recently released Pokopia, and one of the first things players pointed out was how expressive and distinct the Pokemon felt. It's a strong indication that quirky personalities and independent characters are still a huge part of what makes these worlds feel alive. But when the player controls almost everything about the environment, that relationship starts to break down. In New Horizons, being able to reshape the terrain and decide where rivers go and where the cliffs go, the world no longer pushes back against the player in the same way that it once did. Instead of discovering the character of the town, players are now tasked to create the character of the town. Naturally, that changes how people approach the game. While that level of creative freedom opened up entirely new possibilities for the series, it also had an unintentional side effect. When the player controls everything about the town, the world, the island around them, the world becomes less of a place and more of a project. So this raises an important question for the future of the series. When going forward, what's the game plan? Nintendo is now at a fork in the road. There are specific expectations that the players now have that the series needs to deliver on. They expect terraforming, they expect freedom with decorations, and they expect total control over their environment. Removing any of these systems would feel like a downgrade. And knowing Nintendo, that's typically something they try to avoid. With the removal of control, players feel restricted. But if Nintendo expands player control, the game leans further into being a sandbox. Two competing identities where on one hand, it's a life simulation, and on the other, it's a creative sandbox. With the next installment, they can't just add more furniture or bigger towns. They have to figure out how to make the world feel alive again, in a game where players control everything. And that might very well be the biggest challenge the series has ever faced. For most of its history, Animal Crossing was built around one simple idea. You weren't the architect of the town, you were just somebody living inside of it. But New Horizons changed that relationship entirely. The world no longer exists independently of the player, and instead, the player now has the tools to shape almost every aspect of it. While that freedom opened up some incredible creative possibilities, it also raised an interesting question for the future of the series. The more control the player has over the world, the harder it becomes for that world to feel like it exists as its own entity. So the real challenge for the next Animal Crossing might not be bigger islands or more furniture. It might be figuring out how to make the world feel alive again. So I pose this question to you. What do you think the future of Animal Crossing is? I really enjoyed New Horizons, so don't get me wrong, but looking back at it in retrospect, the only thing I really recall was how much of a creative sandbox it was. The villagers were so copy and paste that I genuinely don't remember any interaction with them. They were purely props, decorations attempting to appear semi-alive. It feels like the series strayed far from the original blueprint. So here's hoping they can find a nice middle ground for the future. And that's the video. I hope you liked it and my thoughts about it. Me personally, I'd like to know your thoughts. So let me know in the comments what you think. Don't forget to leave a like, which helps a ton. And maybe give me a big old wet subscribe too. All right, you little freaks. I'll see you in the next one.